Hey everybody, welcome. I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta. We're here at our offices at Constellations, one of our great sponsors for today. We appreciate them letting us have use of the space. We're in the, what do we call it? The mission control conference room. Everything has a nice space theme here. So we're ready to lift off with our conversation with JT Way. Before we get started and before I get too deeply into his biography and everything, I wanted to thank our sponsors, the Atlanta Global Studies Center. If you don't know, the Atlanta Global Studies Center is a collaborative center between Georgia Tech and Georgia State University, and their mission is to empower the region's global agenda. I really like that phrasing. We are also here with an in-person audience, so just a few housekeeping issues. We normally would have them up on our other screen here, but unfortunately there was a technical difficulty with Murphy's Law fully in effect here, so we're not able to show you their waving, smiling faces, but we just wanted to let you know that they're here as well. So we have some joining virtually, some joining in person, and we're excited about our discussion. At the end, we will have some opportunity for questions, so our virtual participants, you'll be able to submit those via the chat function. Again, without the other screen set up, we're not able to take speaking questions. But also our folks here will be able to ask their questions in person, and we'll go from there. So I wanted to thank, again, Atlanta Global Studies Center. I wanted to thank Gene Kansas Commercial Real Estate and Constellations for hosting us. So this is the seventh in our Authors Amplified series. So we've had, again, 6 other events where we focus on like the name suggests, amplifying local voices in international affairs and international business. So today is no different. We've got a special treat for us today. JT Way. JT, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And JT, and we got connected, and JT was a speaker at one of our other events focused on migration, and I think we'll get into some of those issues maybe a little bit later in the talk and how your book relates to that broader trend. But first of all, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of you. So you're Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University, and this is your second book, Agrotropolis. I've got the copy here. And I love the subtitle. I think it's a pretty apt subtitle once you start reading the book, Youth, Street, and Nation in the New Urban Guatemala. I'll ask you about that in just a second, but here's the book. They're on sale as well. But I think your first book was called, which I think may be an even better title, The Mayan in the Mall, Globalization, Development, and the Making of Modern Guatemala. And I really found that fascinating based on what we do, which is connecting Atlanta, showing how globalization affects one place, Atlanta. And I think we'll get into a great conversation extrapolating.
Sideways, I think.
You lived in Guatemala for 2 years, and I think suffice to say is extensively studied the nation's popular class, and we'll get into that as well. And tell us about your position at Georgia State, first of all, since Georgia State's one of our sponsors, and what led to your study of Guatemala.
Well, at Georgia State, I am a member of the history department. I started there 9 years ago in 2012 and moved to Atlanta from Antigua, Guatemala, where I was living at the time, directing a research institute. And I just have to give a shout out to the Georgia State students. They are the best
Wow.
anywhere. They're fantastic.
I think we got some on the call too, so good job.
And yeah, I really love being in Atlanta as well, and here with you today. And I think the second part of your question.
Yeah. So so you moved to Guatemala in 2002, and then I guess left from Guatemala to come here. But walk us back to your initial journey to the country. What got you involved there in the first place, and what captivated you so that you decided to devote a lot of your research and career to that?
In 1991, 30 years ago, I just passed the anniversary. I quit a corporate job in commercial publishing to find the meaning of life, and I ended up backpacking through Latin America for 14 months. And of all the countries I visited, the one I had to come back to and come back to and come back to was Guatemala. I wandered into that country with very little knowledge, and it was a country that was still very much at war under a military occupation, and that also has a cultural diversity that is, I think, unparalleled in the Americas. And so it blew my mind and it changed my mind.
Was there a sense that, I mean, I feel like, and maybe this is my own ignorance, but I feel like Guatemala sometimes is more misunderstood than other Central American countries, or just not covered as much or examined as much. Did you find that, and was that part of the intrigue as well?
Well, I think that's true, Trevor, in the media and in popular culture at large. So, for example, in the years before my travels, one heard all the time on the news and the radio about Nicaragua, and secondarily El Salvador, but very little about Guatemala. In the academy, it's a little different. There are more scholars covering Guatemala, not just in history, but also particularly in anthropology. Than there are covering certainly the other two countries of the Northern Triangle, El Salvador or Honduras. So Guatemala is a little overrepresented
in the scholarly
academy, but underrepresented.
Yeah, makes sense. And so, it's my fault in the media here, so I'll take some responsibility for that, because really there's a major Guatemalan and Mayan community actually in Georgia as well, and I have to say I haven't really spent much time covering it, so shame on us, but we're working to correct our errors. But so 1991, that's interesting because it's not too long after the kind of front bound of the book, right? Because you started in 1983, I think. Tell us why you started in 1983, and maybe give us a quick sketch of Guatemalan history leading up to that, and why you chose that year to kind of start the book.
Well, the main reason is that 1983 marked both the apex of the genocide that the Guatemalan military state committed against the Maya people. And I'm trying to do this as briefly as I can.
We got some time, so don't worry.
There was a military head of state, Efraín Rios Montt, who couped and was in power for a little over a year, from 82 to 83. And when he was couped out, the military began seriously moving the country toward a civilian government. And so there was a constituent assembly. I hesitate to make this government sound too good, because it was an extremely repressive government. But in 1986, you did see that the country returned to civilian rule. And 10 years after that, in 1996, they signed, the guerrillas and the state signed peace accords, ending a 36-year-long civil war.
Well, give us, so a few decades leading up to 83, how did they get to the point where there was this repression and genocide? I mean, it seemed to me that the milieu, or whatever, was the Cold War struggle in a way, and then there was kind of a reactionary right-wing sort of suppression of supposed communist or left-wing elements, and that this was conflated potentially with the Mayan people, right? Like that, there was some support from the Mayan ethnic group for the leftists, but it was not necessarily such that it needed to take the shape that it did. So, in terms of the reaction to it, so give us your sense of that. I mean, that's my really rudimentary understanding from reading the first bit of the book, where you introduce that section.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Trevor. So in 1944, there
what I'm getting at is, where does the U.S. fit into this? That's what I'm trying to bring home here.
So in 1944, there was a democratic revolution in Guatemala that ended oligarchic, kind of militaristic rule, and started what's now known as the 10 years of spring in Guatemalan history. Really a popular democracy, but also this was a period that established the modern Guatemalan state. Its social security system, such as it is, the way its government is structured, et cetera, et cetera. Toward the end of this period, the second president of the 1944 to 54 period launched an agrarian reform, whereby the government would buy unused land from large landowners by force. They were forced to sell it, and then distribute it to small farmers. And one of the large landowners that they targeted was the United Fruit Company. And the head of the United Fruit Company was buddies with the head of the CIA and the Secretary of State. And so there was a massive disinformation campaign. It was really fake news, right? It was PSYOPs.
Yeah.
And the CIA cooperated with some disgruntled, exiled military officers to stage sort of a fake invasion of Guatemala in 1954.
Wow.
Which set off a period of far less than democratic rule, typically, almost always, headed by a military officer, that lasted all the way until 1986.
Wow.
So the U.S. really destabilized.
Was there tacit or explicit support for, these right-wing elements that came into power, especially during the genocide? Obviously, it seems like the U.S. knew what was happening, but what was the level of engagement, I guess, between the two governments?
Right. So in 1960, right after the victory of the Cuban Revolution, you see the rise of left-wing guerrilla groups in Guatemala that they're not like the old school communists who want to first build an industrial society and then, the sort of gradual route to communism. They want to go the Cuban route and overthrow the government. And they're initially defeated in the eastern part of the country, which is not where the bulk of the Mayan population lives. And by the 1970s, they're regrouping, and they're heading up into the Mayan highlands, and finding an increasing amount of support among the Mayan population, not just for the guerrilla movements, but for the social movements in general. The peasant leagues, the labor unions, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, by the end of the very end of the 1970s, the policy turns towards scorched earth and genocide. And
is that because they could not determine who was on which side, or was it because they painted with such a broad brush to basically try to wipe out all the oppositional elements?
They painted it with a broad brush to try to wipe out the oppositional elements, absolutely. Within Guatemala, there are hundreds and hundreds of years of elite terror of indigenous uprising, because half of the population, more or less, is indigenous. The United States absolutely knew what was going on, although no one would, I believe, say that the U.S. planned or openly approved the idea of going from village to village in the remote highlands and massacring every living human being. The fact remains that the generals were trained in the School of the Americas, and the military was funded with U.S. aid and the like. And you have to remember that the victory of the Sandinistas in 1979 in Nicaragua really ratcheted up the level of fear about the expansion of Soviet/Cuban style communism.
Yeah, I think that's important, because that gives us a sense for what was going on at the time, what the prevailing kind of fear and sentiment was. And same thing we saw, I guess, happen in Asia, where we have to contain this or it's going to spread throughout the region. This was in our backyard, right? So supposedly your backyard. So why did you choose the title Agrotropolis? Because I think the uninitiated could see that and think it's more about the agro part than the tropolis part. And I think that it's a fascinating framing of the subject, because you talk about really the blurring of the traditional rural-urban divide. And I wondered and it's almost to me like two books in one. It's you've got that part, but then you've got how the identity creation of the youth after 1983 fits into that development. So tell us about, I guess, the discovery of this kind of framing. Like, how did you think through that? And then, go from there, I think.
Well, I think to answer that, I have to start with my first book, The Mayan and the Mall, which is, in few words, an urban history of Guatemala. In other words, it's a history of Guatemala City, which is the largest city in Central America, but is vastly undercovered in the scholarly literature, in part because it's such an unpleasant place, I think, to stay and do research. It's got some great little parts, but in general, not a very nice city. But that book covered the urban working class and their living conditions and their markets. And so this book, in a lot of ways, is a sequel to that.
Yeah.
So the first book started in 1920 and kind of wound down by the 1980s, and so this picks up.
Okay.
But the urban story by arguably the middle of the 1990s isn't really just about Guatemala City and the few kind of secondary and tertiary cities, places like Quetzaltenango, for example, anymore. The urban fabric of the nation is now found in municipal cabeceras, which are what they call municipal capitals, kind of like county seats, right? Around the country. And there are a large number of factors that I enumerate at great length in the book that drive this, and that I'd be happy to talk about more. But in this incredibly agrarian country, and it's still very much an agrarian country, and hence the agro, you get this urbanization of the countryside that gives rise to an urban modality that is pretty unique, because the agro part doesn't go away. And so your point about intertwining two stories, one about kind of popular youth culture and sort of the ludic things that people do in their free time, right? Is working to illuminate the cultural side of what otherwise is an economic history or a history of infrastructure. You know, I have the data to say when San Mateo Ixtahuacan got its second telephone and repeat that town by town, small city by small city, but that gets a little boring.
And it doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, statistics are only part of it. But, you know, you talk about the use of music in creation of identity, and your chapter headers are either lyrics or song titles, and I found that very fascinating. And I was wondering if you could, well, I guess before we get to that, talk about some of the characters that you encountered in researching the book. I mean, you lived there, you spent time in these provincial cities, you made it an effort to go out of your way, like what we've called, I guess, in the bio, the working class or the popular class. But I think your historical knowledge and your research was rounded out by anecdotal experience, right? And I wondered if you can talk about that and why that was important to include in the book.
Oh, absolutely. The experiences of people, both who were what you would think of standard kind of important historical actors, right? Authors, guerrilla leaders, that kind of thing. And people who I met and knew, you know, and spent time with, add a human dimension to the book that I hope makes it more readable. And the lived experience of being in these places is one that, on the one hand, and we'll get to this when we get to migration, right? It's heartbreaking. People are, you know, increasingly going to school and seeing a world of opportunity that didn't exist, but there's no work for them. And they're moving around more and are exposed to more cultural inputs than they were before, and of course all the new technology as we get up into the internet age. But at the same time, the common crime, the lynching, the extortion rings, just the danger of everyday life is increasing exponentially.
Yeah, there was kind of a wryness about the way some of your characters described life. They were very realistic, so you didn't get a sugar-coated version of the history, right? Like or the history's effects in the modern day. You really felt it through. One guy drew you a cartoon, for instance, about American involvement in Guatemala that I found it was a little salty but interesting and very realistic, you know. But I was going to ask you about agricultural policy and how that played into the this type of urbanization that has been sort of melding the two regions or types of regions together. You talked about how certain crops were instituted and by the government in order to try to grow incomes, but they were not necessarily the crops that came naturally to people. But talk about that sort of imposition of a national cash crop sort of strategy and how that played into all this.
Right, it wasn't just the government, it was also the private sector, sort of the transnational private sector that instituted the growing of what are called non-traditional agro-exports in Guatemala. So you see them start up in the 70s and then increase over the decades ahead. And so instead of traditional crops, maize and corn and beans being the principal, but also crops like potatoes, wheat in some areas, for example. You start to see broccoli probably being the number one, snow peas, macadamia nuts, roses sort of in the central area of the country.
And this was tied in with the idea that if we give these people better incomes, then we'll ameliorate some of these tendencies towards, joining the guerrilla groups or opposing the government. Is that kind of the idea generally?
Well, sure. There were military-run government agencies that were working with the development agencies, not only in the United States, but of other countries as well, to help spread this, to the idea being that villagers should be growing cash crops because then they can earn money on the world commodity market and have a better standard of living. That's not always how it worked out. Because at the beginning, their plan was to hire the huge plantation owners to do this. And then the day workers, the people actually doing the work, would be in the same sort of downtrodden position they had always been in. But over time, they figured out that it was better to contract directly to small farmers, which on one hand benefited those small farmers, as long as the price for the crop on the world market was good, right?
And as soon as you go from subsistence to selling on a world market, you're all of a sudden susceptible to those kind of swings. And
exactly.
And then that probably drives more urbanization, right? Because you're disconnected from the land now, and you want to move to the city so you can earn more, and you're now reliant on the earnings versus the crops themselves.
Precisely.
Right? Okay.
And so to eclipse over time, I can go back and fill in a lot of the gaps about this history if you want. But what you get are a generation of kids who are born into the agrarian sector, who by and large they want to work in anything but that when they grow up. And there are of course exceptions to that. I can feel anthropologists who work on these agrarian communities getting very angry at me right now. But in general, you see a lot of kids who, if they're going to work in agriculture, they want to be agronomists, right? And they're working their way all the way through at least junior high and often high school, which is a huge accomplishment in the history of this country. And the aspirations of the young, who tend to end up working not in the fields they dream of, but if they get work at all, they're kind of in the service sector, um, and related lines of work. But the income that's coming from the new crops when they're doing well and not plunging people into poverty is teamed with the income that's coming in from migrants to the United States. So at the beginning were really refugees. They were fleeing a genocide.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that for sure, but I wanted to talk about the youth part because that's where I want to get into music. Because again, you preface the chapters with these song lyrics that are illustrative of kind of countercultural sentiments that are bubbling up among the youth population. And the way I think you phrase it is that it is a growing assertiveness that comes along with embracing these sometimes international forms of music like rock and breakdancing and rap, but then it gets indigenized in a way or melded into a unique style that it ends up becoming a marker for their own identity. And so how did the embrace of these foreign forms of music that a lot of people saw as the erasure of Guatemalan culture, how did it actually become its own sort of subculture that helped grow this assertiveness, I guess?
Right. So I'll go to the subtitle because you mentioned that. So Youth, Street, and Nation. As this idea of growing up on la calle, on the street, kind of becomes a popular imaginary, my book argues, you see the rise of an alternative popular nationalism from below. In a country that if you're not familiar with the literature on Guatemala, you should know that this is often described as a state without a nation. Right? That there really isn't a national imaginary that ties people together and gives them that kind of patriotism that we think about with, for example, the American dream. That there isn't that. So I'm arguing that through popular culture, not just music, which is what I detail in the book, but also slang and humor and ways of speaking Spanish, using the voceo, for example, that poor and working class kids basically give rise to a new nationalism. Music is a great way to look at this because it can actually it's approachable by research in a way that how are you going to figure out slang and slang words and how people are using Spanish slang words in indigenous languages and none of it's written down. But for music, you can trace this, and so what were considered bizarre and often antisocial subcultures that started in Guatemala City make their way to the rapidly urbanizing countryside. And this dovetails with a period after the genocide of intense Maya cultural and political activism. And so you get a process, the very use of the word Maya dates to this period, because before then, people would not have called themselves Maya.
They would identify based on their linguistic group or their region where they lived? Or
Exactly. They would call themselves Cachiqueles or Quiche or their ethnic group, or exactly by a place name. And so anthropologists in particular have been interested in this process of Mayanization. And there's a really good literature, and there's going to be more coming out on the political aspect of this and the amazing organizing that folks have done, and the how it dovetails with the pan-indigenous movement that's global, but certainly has a really strong presence in the Americas. What we don't know so much about is how ordinary, everyday people in neighborhoods that are changing by the minute, incorporated this, and that's what I'm trying to look at in this book, and what I've seen at play in the lives of some of the informants.
Well, and to me it was interesting when you outlined how music, each class, or you even described it as caste, embraced certain musical forms and wanted to claim that form as their own, and that even led to its own kind of outpouring of violence in a culture that you argue is kind of has violence baked into the DNA from the 20th century, right? Like that there was this, even in the 80s and 90s, once these rock forms came in, there were sort of the rockers versus the b-boys, and these were ways to classify people by what they saw as their identity, and they didn't want someone from another class trying to take over the musical form that they associated with themselves. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I just found that fascinating.
That's a really great summary of a story that changes in its contours and articulations throughout the course of the book. So it's also a story that bounces back and forth between Guatemala City and the agro-urban centers around, or agro-urbanizing centers around the nation. So we start in the late 1990s and into the late 1980s and into the early 90s with what were called the break wars in Guatemala City, which were deadly street wars between kids from the poor neighborhoods who were taking up breakdance and stomp and those styles that are associated with what's going to be the rap revolution, right? And the heavy metal, sort of hard rock. Richer, lighter-skinned kids from the colegios, the private schools, and they would kill each other. And while this originally started as rich on poor violence, by the 90s, the poor kids have started to fight back, and it's ultimately their idiom that really catches fire around the country. And as that's happening, you get in the era of peace, now we're into 96 peace accords, you get a whole new Guatemalan rock sound that's really tied up with the mission of no more war between guerrillas and governments, but also between youth bands on the streets.
Well,
right?
I found it interesting too that there was a regulatory or governmental aspect to this too, because security, whatever that means, was often used as justification for these social cleansing campaigns and crackdowns in various agro-urban environments. And I found that there could be some sort of parallel to what we see in the U.S. today with, this idea of crime being on the rise, and there's sort of a counter reaction that's going on here. And I wonder if how you kind of view that, the way that the authorities approached the issue of crime and violence, because obviously you can't not do anything about it, right? But you also can't use it as justification for just indiscriminately cracking down on everybody. So, but in the absence of trust, right, these kind of localized vigilante groups almost kind of sprung up, right?
Sure, and so you see in those first break wars where there are some young students from the University of San Carlos in Guatemala who actually grew up in this, who went out and there's one thesis in particular that I cite again and again and again, because the author clearly knows people personally who were involved in these wars. The word is that a lot of these were children of the people in the death squads and the police and the security forces. We're in the 80s now, the height of the violence. But there's a criminalization of youth in general, and I think this is what you're getting at when you make the parallel, that pretty much whatever they're doing, it's bad, and anti-social. So when you get these sort of styles that are associated with, rap or hip hop as time goes along, but earlier than that, even with the grunge sound or the heavy metal, which was always a small but important subculture, just having that look could be associated with being a gang member, being a delinquent, being someone who needs to be disciplined and punished. In
and that
some way.
overlaid with kind of a caste sort of mentality, right? Like if you're from the indigenous community, or like that could be another kind of compounding problem, right?
Absolutely. And what you see, Guatemala has many, many, many towns and even small cities that are predominantly indigenous. So 80, 90% of the people who live there are indigenous. But there's also a huge gray zone, if you look at the national territory as a whole, between poor Latinos, in other words, poor people who are not indigenous, and indigenous people who look, their physical features, the way they look is very similar.
Yeah.
And what I do a lot in the book is try to look at this through the lens of caste and not just racial or ethnic categories that can be very easily essentialized. In other words, to kind of look at it the way the people living in the poor neighborhoods look at it. And you see the rise of distinctions that they're pre-existing, but they get sharpened, right? And the names of new groups and categories that kind of correspond in one way or another to these youth categories. Like you might be familiar with the Mexican term naco, right? But shumo is widely used in Guatemala, and that's a caste word. It's a bad word. It has, I sometimes translate it as brown trash, is kind of if an elite person says it as an insult, as a slur. That's how they mean it. And no one would ever call themselves that, for example. But that word can just as easily refer to a mestizo person who has a Ladino identity or Latina identity as it can to an indigenous person.
So part of its wealth, part of its ethnicity, part of its culture, but there is stratification, and everyone's negotiating that and trying to figure out what that means for them.
Yeah, and the people who are getting this applied to them have a very assertive, over time, hey, the hell with you attitude about this. And they assert themselves not just in politics and in social movements and in demonstrations and anti-mining campaigns and things we know a lot about, but also in very everyday ways in culture.
Well, I think that's what you kind of illustrate as the big shift, right? That this assertiveness has come after centuries of oppression, right? And even you mentioned the governance structure in some of the Mayan communities, if you want to call it that, goes back to this mayoral structure that was set up by the Spaniards in the 1500s, right? And now they're kind of reconstituting that, and making it their own in a way, as they also gain political power. So I thought that was interesting. But I wanted to bring it back, because we're about to open it up for questions. I wanted to bring it back to the immigrant question, the migration question, because you talked about the first wave was sort of refugees from the genocide and the war. But then as time has gone on, remittances have become a much more important part of the Guatemalan economy, particularly with what we talked about with agriculture, not always meeting up. So I guess the question from my perspective, and maybe this is the wrong question, you can reframe it if you want, but so we talk about stemming migration, getting to the root causes of these issues that are causing people to come to the U.S. I guess, is there a way that we can do that, and what's our sort of, I say our in terms of the U.S. government, right? What's its complicity in creating the conditions that led to this migration in the first place?
Not a small question there.
Sorry, it was kind of like multiple questions baked into one. But
let me dive into
that. And then we'll open it up for everybody else to ask simpler, better articulated questions.
I want to break that last bit into two pieces. And one, there's a historical trajectory that we already talked about a lot of how the United States overthrew their government, helped to institute right-wing military rule. And so there's a long historical legacy of how the United States has directly contributed to the problems in Guatemala. I want to bracket that and leave that aside. And I think an important point to know about what the U.S. is doing in Guatemala today that is arguably, certainly not helping and arguably causing problems, is not just unilaterally the United States. It's the donor nations working together with multilateral institutions, ranging from the United Nations to the World Bank, and particularly the Inter-American Development Bank.
Yeah.
And these policies were put in place at a time of the neoliberalization of the global economy. So when I explained it to my students in the classroom, you know, to get them into these sets of questions that have no one right or wrong answer, right? It's that the same forces that are causing a lot of problems and hardship in the United States, it's those same forces that are causing problems in Central America.
Well, you call it, I love this, I want to mention it in case you didn't, but you called it Americamorphosis, and I think that was taken from a song.
Yes.
And also, you know, you call it the NGOification of the economy. So, well, what's your alternate history? Like, because I think that the big question, someone might respond to that and say, well, if those are causes of problems, then should we just not have done anything? Should we let things take their course? Like, how would you, I guess, counsel governments that want to help, you know, in a place like Guatemala? And this kind of gets at what we covered in one of our last sessions is, you know, how do you do kind of development responsibly, I guess?
Yeah, a lot of these programs are really well-meaning, and many of them were embraced by the left as well as the right when they were first introduced, and in fact seemed to be a response to the demands of the social movements and that kind of thing. A great example is municipal decentralization. Very few words, devolving a whole ton of responsibility and money to mayors and municipal governments around the country. That a great idea, you know, popular grassroots democracy, people decide how to spend their own development money, but what it's resulted in is a nest of graft and corruption, mayors getting burned alive, city halls getting burned down, narco traffickers infiltrating municipal government, not quite in Guatemala to the extent that they have in Honduras, but still to a significant extent. Graft kickbacks, it's just a terrible situation.
So in principle, the idea of local controlled direct democracy is great, but the implementation has not been so idyllic, I guess.
In my opinion, that's the number one thing the development community, including the United States, could work to fix.
Interesting. Well, I want to go first to our virtual people. Do we have any questions? If we don't, then looks like we don't. I want to get some questions from our audience here. And if you just note your question, then I'm going to repeat it for the people on the call, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so your book starts at Lake Atitlan, and in 1948, Sal Tax did a study of Lake Atitlan, and there were about 28 different communities, very different in their dress, their styles, their specializations, their customs, and just uniquely different from each other. So, what's happened to that? Is there any remnant of that today? Has it all been like globalized away, or?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I'm sorry I haven't looked at you the whole time.
Yeah, I feel like I should have flipped sides here, but give us a synopsis of the question, just briefly.
So the question was, the book opens in Lake Atitlan in Sololá Department in the highlands of Guatemala. An anthropologist named Soltax wrote a study of this in the 40s, and it was incredibly diverse and lots of little villages and different cultures. And what's happened to them? Are they still there? Are they globalized away? What's the story? Does that do it justice?
I'm going to walk around with my mic for the next one.
And the answer is they are absolutely still there. Absolutely, they're still there. And to a great extent, that the cultural vibrancy of this place has been enhanced by the Maya Renaissance, by the Mayan movement and its cultural activism that really it dates to the 80s, but went kaboom in the 90s and the years since. And new generations have taken this up in really creative ways and made it their own. And so has it transnationalized a little? Are there people rapping, for example, in Tsutuhio Maya? Yes, we meet them in both the introduction and the conclusion to the book. But to my mind, and this is just my opinion, I don't think that implies in any way the destruction or fading away of these cultures. And certainly the youth who participate in this, who are participating in this now or have in their younger days, they don't see it as their culture being wiped out. They just see it as it's expanding, it's adding to, not taking away from. Now, the problems, the crime, extortion, and that sort of thing, Lake Atitlan is not as hard hit as other places, but these still exist, and I tell the story of several grisly lynchings and violent events in that area. But no, you should absolutely go to Lake Atitlan. You will not be disappointed.
Great. Anybody else have a question here, or do we have? I don't know if we have any from the audience on virtually. Not yet. All right. Well, if you do, go ahead and get that question in. I'm going to come to you, Sarah, and then we'll have one more chance for anybody online to ask, and then we'll probably close it up and do our signing here.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you so much for being here. This is great. You talked about the Maya Renaissance. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more and give some more context as to what that's taking shape to be?
Yeah. So let's go back to the 1980s. There's, of course, a prehistory to this of Maya cultural activism, and that has always been there. But I'll pick it up in the 1980s with the absolute crisis and horror that existed in the wake of the Guatemalan genocide, where the army went really through hundreds and hundreds of Mayan villages and massacred every living human being. And it's from that period of the most brutal kind, it's almost unspeakable in its brutality, right? It's from that period that you get activists such as, most famously, Rigoberta Menchú, who I think you've all heard of, right? If you haven't heard of Rigoberta Menchú, and Rigoberta Menchú, who won the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize, look that up because it's really important. So she sort of becomes the main spokesperson of what is really a widespread campaign to do a number of things in a number of spheres. So one of those things is to give the Maya a greater voice within the leftist movements, not only the armed guerrilla movements, but also the social movements. And because these were by and large led by people who were themselves not indigenous. To give the Maya a voice in the peace talks that really start to become a thing sort of around late 1990, but really 1991, to 1996, it's not like they just signed one piece of accord right at the end, right? It was negotiated over years and years and years, but also at the local level and increasingly the national level to have cultural revitalization on one hand and recognition on the other. So issues such as bilingual education, like kids have the right to be educated in their native language. The recognition and valorization of not only Maya traditions and traditional authorities, such as, I'll just sum that up here as kind of elected elders and community leaders, but it's much more complicated than that. But also political entities, such as the Alcaldía Indígena, which is the Maya mayoralty, which dates back to the 1500s and has survived the attempts of government after government after government over the centuries to wipe it out. Well, it's still there, and people are still electing their own authorities. And this dovetails, and I know we want to take more questions, so I'll sum it up, but this dovetails with indigenous movements and politics and cultural activism throughout the hemisphere and the planet in the 1990s and into the new millennium. So a few of us were talking about Bolivia before this talk. So you can find other great examples of this. It's not just Guatemala, but this is the Guatemalan.
I wanted to ask one more question, and if we don't have any on the Zoom call, then we'll probably close it up. But I feel like maybe I didn't get to this part, but how has modern social media and technology played into all this in terms of the youth identity, right? Because all of the stuff that's discussed from the 80s and 90s was before this took off, and there was already this globalization influence where you had MTV and you had FM radio you talk about, but now all this seems to have been supercharged by Facebook, Instagram, et cetera.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I
maybe that's the third book, I don't know. But
well, I'm waiting to see their reaction to this, because there are actually, by the time you get up into sort of the middle of chapter 3 on, I'm using old internet pages that actually aren't still online, and then YouTube videos and Facebook pages, and no end of Chapin, which is slang for Guatemalan, Chapin websites. If we could go back in time and have this, this kind of a popular publishing source from the 1600s, historians would go nuts. We have it for this time period, and it's an invaluable source, and how it's being archived is something we historians really need to think about, because these things can be erased as quickly, or more quickly than they can be made. But I do trace a bunch of these things.
Yeah, and what gets documented, right? Like social media is not really archived in that same way. I mean, it's personally archived, but you have to be very intentional about keeping it. And so these ephemeral kind of postings, that could provide a lot of insight are not necessarily going to be there for us to search. So,
well, one thing I did for the book was I looked at thousands of young Guatemalans' Facebook pages. I ultimately decided that it was unethical to cite those, like even putting a fake name on them. Because they're things people are publishing personally for their friends. So I only cited ones that had a group or organization named at them. Or I kind of summarized and described without referencing any one site.
Well, that's an interesting historical approach to talk about, for sure. I wanted to thank you, JT. This has been fascinating. Really appreciate you coming in and doing this, and I know our audience here appreciates this as well. We're a little bit over time, so I'm probably going to go ahead and close it out. But first of all, I wanted to thank Aurora Perez, who's here, our producer here, manning the cameras, and she's been really great at organizing this, and anybody who's participating has seen her emails to you. So really appreciate her, our events and engagement coordinator. And I want to thank you from Global Atlanta, and also again thank the Atlanta Global Studies Center. Stay tuned. We're going to be hosting these every month, so we'll be reaching out to you with the next one. Thanks again, JT. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
All right.